Hello, my name is Joshua Paisley, and welcome back to the Observation podcast series, After Dark. This is where we pick a fictional election from a TV series, novel, or movie and try to flesh it out. October 2006 was a fascinating time to be alive, an age before the iPhone, when Chelsea could call themselves Premier League champions, and the song I Don't Feel Like Dancing by the Scissor Sisters sat at number one. Times really have changed. On our television screens, we watched The Amazing Mrs Pritchard, a 6-part BBC drama that imagined what might happen if an ordinary woman, Ross Pritchard from Yorkshire, suddenly became Prime Minister. In this episode, we'll be unpacking the rise, rule, and maybe resignation of Ross. Today, I have the pleasure of welcoming onto the podcast Stephen Fielding, a professor of political history at the University of Nottingham and the author of the book A State of Play. Hello, Stephen. How are you getting on?
Hello, I'm fine, thank you.
So, Stephen, could you tell our listeners about how you first came across the series, The Amazing Mrs Pritchard?
Well, I happened to be writing that book, that very book that you mentioned. I decided that I couldn't be bothered writing any more about the Labour Party. I'd reached the end of my tether. I couldn't say anything more useful, if I ever said anything useful about the Labour Party. I decided to take a slightly changed direction, and I always had an interest in politics as it's depicted on the screen in comedies. This was a time of the thick of it, as well. So I decided to have a look at how politics had been, looked at, depicted by dramatists from Dickens, as it turned out, up to the thick of it. And The Amazing Mrs Pritchard just happened to be on it, and while I was doing this research, so I became particularly interested in what Sally Wainwright, the writer who's gone on to write all kinds of really big things for the BBC. She's always writing things for the BBC, and see how she dealt with the issue of politics.
I mean, I was going to get into this later, and we were going to do the synopsis right now, but actually, you touched on a point which we could focus on now, which is that comparing The Amazing Mrs Pritchard to, at the same time, you've got In the Thick of It coming out. And so where do you place The Amazing Pritchard in that kind of pantheon of British politics series?
Well, the more I got to look at the thick of it, as opposed to just watching it and laughing at it and enjoying it, and the more I started to look at it and think about what he was really saying about politics. Basically, it's really lazy. It's satire. It's taking the mickey. It does it very well of the present of what was then the present situation between New Labour, and then the changing nature of the Conservative Party under David Cameron, which came a bit later after Mrs Pritchard. But it offered no solutions. It was just the only solution was just to laugh at them. Right? I couldn't find any actual solutions. It's a comedy. Maybe that's asking too much. But the one thing about Mrs Pritchard, we'll talk about the solutions maybe. Well, we definitely will. The solutions might be naive, very simplistic, or whatever. But essentially, it was addressing a similar problem, a kind of disenchantment with how politics was being conducted. But at least the writer Sally Wainwright, as opposed to Armando Iannucci, was coming up with what she thought were some kinds of solutions to the problem that both of them were identifying.
And what is that solution that they identified?
Yeah, well, if at this point we get into a little bit of the synopsis. I don't know how serious Sally Wainwright was in the particularities of the solution, but in The Amazing Mrs Pritchard, the solution was, Ross Pritchard is a superstore manager, and it's 8 weeks. The series starts 8 weeks before the actual 2005 general election. And she despairs of the choice that's put to the country, the real choice that just a year before, because the series comes out in 2006, the year before that the country was faced, i.e. Tony Blair, and it's stated explicitly, well, he lied to us, well, at least over Iraq, but he lied to us, so do you want to vote for him? Or the Tory bloke, Michael Howard at that point, he was a sort of stopgap Tory leader. And the point was that the viewers watching it would have thought, no, I don't want to vote for either of them, because they didn't. In 2005, turnout was just over 60%, which is the second lowest turnout in the modern democratic era. And Labour got, as a percentage share, it got something like 35%, which was of the votes cast. But actually, in terms of numbers, more people didn't vote at all than voted for Labour. So Mrs Pritchard is one of these.
It's interesting you say that about the vote share, because
Yes.
that felt as if at the start of the second episode, when she is the Prime Minister, it makes a very stark point about 54% of the vote share voted for Mrs Pritchard. So is that a debate that's going on at that time about the electoral system and maybe changes that need to be made?
Well, I don't think there was a big push for changing the electoral system, but there was some kind of frustration with the choice between Labour. I mean, 2005 is a kind of post-Thatcher period. Labour under Tony Blair had accepted most, not all, but most of the Thatcher settlement. And by 2005, the Conservatives had come along with, they'd basically accepted a lot of the things that Labour was doing in government. So there was a question of how different are these two political parties? What is the nature of the choice? And this was also the time when leaders of all the parties, including the Liberal Democrats, were saying, you know what, left and right don't mean anything anymore. We're all pragmatists. Ideology means nothing. Now we just want to focus on the problems as they really are. So left and right, as far as the elite debate was concerned, meaningless. So I think quite a few people were wondering, what is the kind of choice that we've got now? And as I say, 2005. By 2005, New Labour had lost quite a lot of support, partly, or some say maybe largely, over Iraq. Tony Blair was deeply unpopular, but the Conservatives weren't much better off, really, given what they'd done before 1997. So Mrs Pritchard is kind of articulating through Sally Wainwright what she considered to be, and what actually did seem to be, a lot of people's frustrations and disappointment with the choice they were given. Now, whether the solutions that Pritchard, Sally Wainwright comes up with, that's something to think about. But certainly, I think it was identifying an issue that a lot of people thought to be important. And there was also at the background this kind of, I think, a bit sort of soft-headed feminism, that the idea that the more women in politics, the better politics will be, because women are more sensible, more common sense than men. I mean, at this point in time, about 20% of MPs were women, but that had doubled from 1997. Yeah. So this is relatively early. It's still a minority. It's much bigger than it used to be, but it's still low. And women didn't really have a very, New Labour was.
But that's still very far off 50% though.
Oh yeah, absolutely. So there was scope for people to think the more women that are in politics, the better it will be. I don't know that there are some political scientists that suggest in some instances it does in fact improve politics, but generally speaking, it was a view amongst some people, and Ross Pritchard was embodying it. Ross Pritchard ends up running a party that is largely, if not quite exclusively, led by women. Her cabinet that she forms, I think when I watched that, I saw one male face. That could have been the civil servant. I mean, it is basic. And Sally Wainwright, the writer, she does do dramas which always involve strong women in leading roles. So, and it's no surprise. I mean, because I was actually doing research on this, so this is real stuff. 60% of the audience was women for this show. So maybe they were seeing something.
That's fascinating.
They were seeing something that they were agreeing. More women should be involved in politics, and there they are watching it as at least in a fictionalized form.
Yeah, Stephen, I'd be interested to hear what you think. So when I was watching it, I thought exactly on your point about women and breaking this glass ceiling as a big theme. Yeah. But I thought it was actually quite pro-Thatcher in a way. And there was lots of takes back to, so Catherine, for example, who is the Conservative MP who then defects.
Yes.
There's a scene where she talks about Thatcher in very glowing remarks. And I mean, Thatcher is such a controversial figure, whatever side you think on the political spectrum. Is this representative of 2006? I thought that was just a really interesting theme to go along with
no, he's not. No, is a short answer to that. And generally speaking, 2006, even the Conservatives were trying to move away from Thatcher in 2006. The irony was that most of British politics, in terms of how public services were run, and how the economy generally was run, was basically Thatcherite. You know, she reversed all of the Attlee stuff, so it was all, you know, private and whatever. But Thatcher as a politician was toxic, really, even within elements of the Conservative Party. But the problem for any writer who wants to big up, you know, women in politics, she's not the only one, right? So I'm not surprised that that she was being talked of in positive terms. Because, and the other point is that Ross Pritchard's party is formed of women who've never been involved in politics before, like herself. And also in her cabinet, she's got this former Tory who becomes a chancellor. She's got a former Liberal Democrat who is the Home Secretary, I think, and a former Labour and they're all, you know, and she's Foreign Secretary. And they all appear to get on very well. So it's a kind of fantasy coalition politics. There's no issues that they bring from their former parties because they're all women together being sensible. So I would imagine, I'd be very surprised if Sally Wainwright herself had anything very positive to say about Margaret Thatcher from what I can work out from her politics. But she's the only one you can talk about if you want to talk about women recognisably for the most British public in terms of doing something positive.
Yeah. Another key theme running through is this idea of the Westminster bubble. And so Mrs Pritchard, one of her big policies is let's move Westminster to Bradford. And I mean, firstly, what I wanted to ask you about that is what are the how would that even work?
I don't think there's any constitutional reasons for not doing it. The British Constitution, such as it is, can work anywhere. I don't think it depends where it's working. I mean, it's not exactly. I mean, Andrew Adonis, who was one of Tony Blair's sort of big advisors, Labour minister in the end, member of the House of Lords, he has suggested, you know, as part of levelling up, maybe Westminster should move to Birmingham or Manchester. He didn't say Bradford, but Birmingham or Manchester as a way. And it's a similar reasoning that Pritchard brings up. You know, it'll take things out of London more than Westminster, but London. It will make Westminster more, in some ways, a bit vague in some senses, make it more representative of the country as a whole. So, I mean, it actually dominates quite a lot of the series. Her decision wanting to move to Bradford, which is opposed by in the Lords, but then eventually it's going to go through, and work's already going on before the series ends. So, you know, it does seem to me to be a slight diversion, and particularly these days. I mean, you mentioned right at the start about how 2006 was a very different time. It is. I mean, I was watching it. I watched it when it came out, and then subsequent when I was doing my book as well. And it looks very familiar, but it's a very different country. It's a country before the financial crash. It's a country before austerity. It's a country before Brexit. It's a country in which growth's an issue. You know, we want to have more of it. That'd be nice. But it's not like, can we ever grow again? You know, growth is a kind of fatal issue that, you know, governments can do nothing about. There's more optimism. There's more possibility that things can happen. So in that context, I suppose moving Parliament didn't sound that crazy. But today it would just be, we've got so many problems. You know, let's address the ones that we really need to address first. It wasn't simply about moving Parliament to Bradford. There was all this devolution stuff, bringing decisions. Because one of the serious things that Ross Pritchard talked about was that, the whole idea of a bubble was that decision making. First of all, she said politics isn't rocket science. Although she finds out it's a bit more difficult than she thought. That it's just these men talking gobbledygook to make it sound difficult and to make us poor people, mostly women, think we can't do anything about it. there was a serious thing, and it was, we want to bring decision making down to where people really are, which is an agenda which is often talked about, even by this government, but very little is actually seriously done about it. And the reasoning, at least in the series, which she's brought out, and I'm sure that, people who talk about this issue more seriously, is that it will make people more engaged in politics. If you bring things down to local decision making, they'll think that, well, I can participate in this. So moving to Bradford was really meant to be part of a piece of that kind of devolution agenda, which is a serious one. Like I say, it's talked about, but very little is done about it.
Yeah. But I guess that's, looking back now, I wasn't of any age to watch that series at the time, and I don't know what the political census was at that time. But from my time studying politics, Labour in the late 1990s produced massive devolution. And so where does that criticism come across? Is that to do with Iraq and foreign policy with the US? Where does that Westminster bubble kind of originate in those early 2000s from?
Well, I mean, like Labour did devolve, but it was like as minimalistic as it possibly could. I mean, things have moved on since the original devolution debate. Scotland and Wales and London. I mean, and now we've got mayors, but the extent to which that really manifests its real devolution is certainly moot. So I think there was still a frustration that Britain was still very centralised, run by Westminster, a few middle-aged men in Westminster, in London, and they ran it in their own way. One thing I discovered, because when it was on, this wasn't an era before the internet. The internet existed in 2006, and the BBC did quite a bit of promotional stuff for Mrs Pritchard, and it had if you're interested and you did Amazing Mrs Pritchard, you'd get these different links, and there was one link that was almost like the BBC link but wasn't quite. So you could have quite easily been looking for Mrs Pritchard, and then you clicked onto this link, but then gone to a very different kind of page. The page was run by UKIP, and the page basically said, "We are the real Ross Pritchards. If you feel like she does about politics, you can join UKIP," which was very clever. I mean, it's not up there anymore. They took it down whenever. But you can. But she was tapping into something, and I very much doubt that Sally Wainwright, and you can tell from the content of the series as well, she didn't mean it to be an endorsement for UKIP and the kind of right-wing populism that it embodied, which has now gone on from strength to strength. But it was populist. It was kind of feminist, centrist. I don't know how you would describe it, but it was definitely populist.
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually addressed in the series as well, because there's a point where they say there is no policies and they're in Parliament. Have we got a fascist on our hand, basically? And so you would define Ross as a modern day populist if you were pushed.
Oh, I wouldn't need to be pushed. She was a populist. She believed that the people's will was not being expressed and was being frustrated by a cabal of, and it was, like I say, it was kind of defined in feminist terms to some extent, of these middle-aged men who were keeping it of two different parties, who were keeping it to themselves. But what they weren't doing is representing the people. Now, Ross Pritchard and her Purple Alliance, which is quite of a bizarre colour to pick, because the colour was UKIP's colour at that time. They had all kind of different colours to pick for her party, and yet they went with purple. That's very odd. But anyway, I'm sure that didn't mean any sympathy to UKIP. But her idea was that her Purple Alliance would magically embody the people's will. And that's kind of made apparent when, instead of having they had a manifesto. There are all kinds of questions that need to be asked about this process. But when Purple Alliance gets elected, she's Prime Minister, she decides the Queen's speech will be decided by the people. It will be the people's speech. And she has this kind of we'll ask everybody, what do they want? And then we'll put it all into the people's speech. I mean, that's an embodiment of populism. We won't do it. I mean, the question, I think somebody actually in the series asked, or maybe they didn't, I don't know. Well, didn't we not have a manifesto? weren't we elected on certain policies that we were going to put in the Queen's speech? Oh, no. We'll ask the people. And we don't know the process by which, these millions of completely contradictory ideas were then put into the people's speech. But yeah, she was huge populist. She just was a kind of centrist feminist populist.
Yeah. And so how do you think, I mean, now we're, by today's terms, well, always terms, she's a populist.
Yeah.
But how has watching the series now actually changed the way that you perceive it? And if it was going to be created again, would it be quite a dangerous thing to create?
Well, I mean, what you can see in the Amazing Mrs Pritchard is not consciously by Sally Wainwright, but she is tapping into frustrations that only got worse, only got bigger with the fiscal crisis, with austerity, and which led to Brexit. Immigration's never mentioned in the series. I didn't. If it was like a second. It didn't really feature. But it's populism. And populism in the series is benign. It's benign populism. She's a lovely woman. She will never lie. She's always trying to do the right thing. And actually, what she's doing is also, when she does show leadership, it's in terms of she out of the blue, she decides that she's frustrated by the lack of kind of progress on climate change. So she just says, well, in 6 weeks, nobody in Britain will drive their car. Everyone will stop driving their cars or take public transport, and that will be every Wednesday for the foreseeable future, which is just like, what? And because she shows leadership, and then a lot of people in Britain do. There's a bit of moaning, but they do. So it's a kind of bizarre take on things, but at the heart of it, it's populism. And populism, there's all kinds of different kinds of populism. We now in Britain have got, and around America and in Europe, we've got a very particular kind of populism. And I just think, a bit like the thick of it, I had got increasingly uneasy with the way in which it was undermining and criticising conventional politicians who often are ridiculous and sometimes do lie to us. But ultimately, I think they're trying to do the best they can do in constrained circumstances. And oftentimes, the people who are constraining them are the great British public. The great British public are not a solution in themselves to our political problems, which is what this series is trying to suggest, which is kind of what Nigel Farage suggests he's saying, although we don't that's the language he talks, but whether he really means it, I think, is definitely questionable.
Sorry, so do you think Mrs Pritchard maybe, as you say, shows a more realistic view of what it actually is to be a politician than in the thick of it, which is kind of hyper realistic in a way?
I don't know about realistic, but at least it shows some attempt to have solutions, right? So, literally, Sally Wainwright posits, people have got no faith in politicians anymore. Maybe one of the things you can do is devolve government in this way and that way, right? To make people more responsible. I mean, in fact, there's a speech that Ross Pritchard gives when she's talking about, I'm going to have to, I'll read this. So she's talking about all these changes in government devolving. And she talks about, the reason why the British public, are alienated from politics because you don't have any choice, right? And she's saying, I'm now your choice. I'm now going to give you the ability to get your choices through me out there in terms of policy. But then she says, you've got a responsibility, you, the British public, to participate in this new adventure of politics, that you've got to get involved as well. And that's kind of like, I did things on the Labour government of 1945, and that was their line. We're going to do all these things, nationalise this and create a new welfare state, but we hope and expect that everyone's now going to get involved in politics, participate. There was this real hope amongst progressives. There'd be lots of people participating. Didn't happen. So, I mean, it's kind of an interesting text that is completely fictional, in some cases very silly, but there are some serious ideas. Now, the thick of it, to go back to the comparison, has no serious ideas at all. It's just Armando Iannucci and he's very clever script writers, and there's some wonderful swearing, great inventive swearing in it. Just blown a big raspberry at the present situation as it was. And that's not helpful.
Mm.
At least Mrs. Pritchard was trying to be helpful.
And so how do you think Ross would have done in politics today? Do you think she would have been more suited today than she would have been maybe in 2005?
Well, that discontent and disenchantment and alienation from conventional politics has only got worse, has only increased. And we know who is the biggest single beneficiary of that, Nigel Farage. Jeremy Corbyn tried it. The Green Party's trying to do it. Now, what her actual politics were, hard to pin down. But I would have thought she was kind of like a liberal Democrat, really, if that means anything. But I don't know. I mean, she wouldn't, because in the series actually shows how frustrating she is to the more conventional former Labour, Liberal and Conservative politicians, that she doesn't take collective responsibility seriously. She just goes off on one and declares this free car Wednesday thing. And, you can't do that. I mean, you just destroy your party like that. You can't just put your manifesto to one side and then ask people, well, what do you want? We've had an election, but what do you want? Put it into Queen's Speech.
And so getting back to that difference between the US and the UK, do you think the UK system allows for a more resilient government towards populism than somewhere such as America?
Well, we will find out at the next election, won't we? Given that populism, the thing is, populism has always been there in British politics. There's always been this idea that, Thatcher was a little bit of a populist. They kind of genuflect and talk about, the people, this and whatever. And Tony Blair did the same kind of thing. But a serious populist government, well, we'll find out, won't we? If Nigel Farage gets his hands on government. And I don't know. I mean, many people would have said the American system, which again, America's had more overtly populist kind of movements than we in Britain have had. But nonetheless, they had a supposedly robust constitution, which was meant to be all about process, this and all of that, and washed away, seemingly for the moment. So I wouldn't like to say that the British system is more robust, because lots of robust systems have gone by the board, and I wouldn't. At this moment in time, how British politics is with reform, 10% possibly ahead of the Labour Party. I really wouldn't like to say.
Yeah, and so going back to Ross as an individual, what kind of, obviously we're in an age of social media and constant 24-hour news.
Yes.
What attributes do you think Ross would need to learn or maybe unlearn to survive in politics today?
Well, having said she wouldn't last 2 minutes, that's definitely how one way that it might go with her. But I think this is someone that, when she stood on the steps of Downing Street and she's about to go in for the first time, she said, "I will never lie to you." That's her big, "I will never lie to you." I think she was a genuinely authentic person, right? And when she said certain things in politics, that's what she meant. It might have been inconvenient. It might have been, well, you should have really cleared that with the Chancellor, Prime Minister, and all of that kind of stuff. She was genuinely authentic. Now, the problem with social media is, now people say they want to have authentic politicians. They don't. They want politicians that seem to be authentic. They get politicians who they imagine to be authentic, but are carefully constructed and finessed examples of authenticity. Boris Johnson was not anything like he appeared to be. And yet people thought, good old Boris, I'll vote for him. It was a con job. He could pretend authenticity. Nigel Farage, another one. completely. I strongly deny that he's anything like he really appears. It's a crafted persona. Whereas, but that Ross Ross Pritchard wouldn't survive because she really was authentic.
More widely across the series. Why wasn't there a second season?
Well, I mean, because it was on a knife edge. It clearly was set up for a second series with a big decision going to have to be made. Oh, we don't know what it is. Then it ends, right? So, I mean, the audience was well, like I said, the audience was 60% women, which is normally a good thing. If you've got 60% women, that's something that people, commissioners like. But it only got a maximum of 4 million viewers, and I don't know why if that was maybe, but my theory is that because it was on a Wednesday evening at 9:25 and the Champions League was on ITV in direct competition, and Manchester United were doing particularly well. I think gender maybe, and I would suppose that most of those people watching it were men and all of that. I just don't think it got a big enough audience for whatever reason. And that doesn't mean it wasn't.
God, isn't that ironic?
Well, it is kind of ironic.
Yeah.
But the thing is, right, at the same time, around about the same time, there was, I think, at the BBC at least, an attempt to put on, because 2001 was a big shock to the system when participation was like 59.4%. That was a turnout. As I say, 2005 was a little bit more, but not much more. There was a bit of a push. Well, we've got to do things about politics that make it more, seem more popular, et cetera, et cetera. And there were a few series that the BBC put out, or things that might have become series. Like there was one called The Deputy, which was a bit like a West Wing. It was a deputy prime minister who was, and this was a pilot that never became a series. Who was a good, decent man trying to deal with politics. He didn't dissemble. He's blah blah blah. They put out a few, and I think The Amazing Mrs Pritchard was one of them, but they didn't get audiences. I think that to an extent that was because by this point, and it's a very long-standing traditional trope that politicians are just evil, duplicitous, lying, nasty. This is how viewers wanted to see their politicians, so like House of Cards, which was a few years before then, very popular, presenting the Prime Minister as a kind of Richard III figure. I think those series which try to present politics as being, decent people trying to do a decent job in difficult circumstances, nobody wants to watch that. Nobody wants to watch that. So I think
no. And do you think that's why? Because actually, in the 2000s, we have a real abundance of those TV series.
Yeah.
That, correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think we have that anymore. We don't have these series coming out which are fly on the wall, or in this case, very idealistic views of what we could have in a politician saying, "I will not lie to you." Is that the reason why? Because people just don't want to watch it. It's become too much, basically.
Well, I think when given the opportunity, people don't watch it, but also commissioning editors now just think, well, it's just death. So you do get series. You do get series about politics. Is it The Diplomat, about the American ambassador, and there's all kinds of others, but they're all like hyper, melodramatic, evil, and they're not real. They're not real in any kind of substantive sense. So and
I guess Succession falls into that.
Yes,
into that kind of field.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, about power. Yeah, the way that power is, and I think you've got to be you can be a really bad dramatist and have villains, nasty kind of pantomime villains doing nasty things, and there's lots of plot twists. You don't have to be very good to do that, but you really do need to be a very good dramatist if you're going to make decent people, trying to do the right thing in difficult circumstances. In the wrong hands, that really is boring, right? You need to be really good at that to make that interesting. And that's also the case with actual politicians. The ones that get the attention, the sort of made up authentic ones, they get all the attention, and then the dull ones. I mean, I'm not going to say Keir Starmer, but I'll say Keir Starmer. The dull ones who can't really talk themselves out of a brown paper bag, but in my view, are trying to do, the decent thing. Other people might disagree. I mean, everybody hates him.
Yeah. Okay, before we end the podcast, I think we've got to tell the audience some kind of idea of how this series ends, because it's amazing that there isn't a second season that at least gives some kind of some kind of light to the ending. So it's Ian, the husband of Ross. There's a scandal about his money laundering 15 years ago.
Yes, yeah. You want me to take that?
That's a harsh assessment, Stephen, but maybe
in the first episode, he can't even work the video. I mean, this man's pathetic, right? He's just an embarrassment to his wife.
Yeah.
As soon as she becomes leader of this political organisation, then the son exposes that he pinched a co-worker's bottom at a Christmas party some years before, right? So he's a bit of a silly. Well, I was going to say he's a bit of a silly arse, no pun intended. So there is this underlying, and it's a very soap opera-y thing that he was involved in some money laundering exercise, or his firm was involved in some money laundering exercise. He didn't initiate it. He didn't want to do it. All of this, but they still got £10,000 for doing it. And he kept it secret from his wife, who was Prime Minister, and all these people got to know, but they couldn't tell her, because if then she knew, she'd probably have to resign, or she'd feel she'd have to resign. And so it just ends up, the last scene is him going into her office. She's going to talk to the nation, and we don't know whether she's going to just dump him, resign, or do something else. And like I say, that was clearly set up. It was clearly set up for a second series, which for whatever reason never happened.
What do you think she did, Stephen?
She'd have resigned. She would have forgiven him, idiot though he was. They'd go back to Eatanswill, and she'd go back to her supermarket. But she would have made a big mark, because all the way through the series, it's saying that she's still the most popular Prime Minister ever. People are going along with her agenda. She'd made her mark, and now she could go. Who was that Roman that Boris Johnson cited when he resigned? Anyway, go back to her farm sorry, Cincinnatus or somewhere. It was Cincinnatus anyway. That he gave up leadership of Rome to go back to his farm. Cincinnatus, yes. So she'd do a Cincinnatus, I think, if that was going to be consistent with her. Yes, but for a second series, maybe no, definitely not.
There we go. I think that's all we've got time for, though, Stephen. Thank you very much. Wherever and however you are tuning in for this episode of the After Dark series, thank you for listening to today's episode. If you found yourself interested in our discussion and want to hear more, stay tuned for more episodes. We're available on YouTube and all your streaming apps at Observations Podcast. Thank you.
The Observations podcast is being brought to you by Democracy Volunteers, the UK's leading election observation group. Democracy Volunteers is non-partisan and does not necessarily share the opinions of participants in the podcast. It brings the podcast to you to improve knowledge of elections, both national and international.